strengthened under this government in 2020 by a constitutional amendment called the 20th Amendment. Now, this again was championed by this government, saying we need a very strong executive ruler to address the security and economic dimensions. So give more power to the executive. Now, and many agreed and voted in. We were one of the few who challenged it. We challenged it in the Supreme Court. And because of these court challenges, we were able to weaken some aspects of the amendment. But largely, that amendment has now established a very strong executive presidency who has very limited checks. So when we talk about democracy, we need to keep in mind that no one institution should be all powerful. We need checks and balances. We need independent, robust judiciary that can be an act on the executive. We need an effective parliament that can be a check on the executive. We need independent institutions such as the Attorney General's Department, Human Rights Commission, all of the independent institutions that can be a check on the executive. Unfortunately, with this amendment and the political culture where there is this notion that one individual should have all this power, that check has been removed. And this president also brought in, and this government brought in this notion of a technocratic governance model. So they were relying on those loyal to the executive, former and military officials appointed to key positions, where the president also has a military background. And with it undermining subject matter experts or civil servants. So also not just the strengthening of the executive, we also saw the undermining of structures, institutions, actors who have the expertise on particular issues. And that has also eroded the independent nature of institutions and also debate, because many are now scared to even question the executive. So those are some of the things I think, for you to understand in terms of context. Now, the 2020 pandemic affected every country, including Indonesia and other countries. In Sri Lanka, the pandemic really had a huge impact in terms of the governance as well as the economy. So Sri Lanka is heavily reliant on tourism. With the pandemic and the lockdown, that was affected. So again, revenue was severely impacted because of the closures and the lockdowns we saw in 2020 and 2021. Pandemic also saw further consolidation of the executive power, because there was an excuse saying we need a strong executive to manage the crisis, the health crisis. And in a context where people were not sure what was going on, there was a lot of questions, a lot of uncertainty. There was agreement that, yes, maybe we need a strong ruler to manage this. So we had several both international and domestic events that led to the further consolidation of the executive rule in Sri Lanka. Now, all of this, I'm fast tracking this because we don't have a lot of time, but all of this has contributed to a point where, despite promise of a strong leader who was going to provide all these basic necessities, stability, security, and prosperity, we are in a situation where we have depleted foreign reserves, which means we cannot buy essential items, and we are reliant on international markets for fuel, for gas, for rice, for medicine. So without foreign reserves, we are unable to buy these items. So that has resulted in a scarcity of essential items in Sri Lanka, which has resulted in many people staying in long queues to get basic items, from bread to rice to gas to fuel. So every couple of days, we have to go and stay in line to get some of these basic things. And sometimes, especially last week, We saw petrol and diesel lines that went on for sometimes over a day, and because there was such a shortage. We also saw power cuts, long power cuts introduced in the last few months. In March and April, we saw power cuts up to 13 hours, 14 hours, and again, hugely affected various sectors, the industries, education, health sector, and that also created a lot of anger and frustration among people. So long queues, long power cuts. We also saw many people staying in long queues in the hot sun collapsing because they didn't have enough sufficient nutrition, because that's also a huge issue. Now, I don't have time to go into all of that, but just to say, there's been several deaths reported of those who've been staying in line, those who couldn't get medicines in time. So, political, economic crisis, but now we're seeing a humanitarian crisis with people not being able to get food items, getting the sufficient medicines. So it's extremely down on the ground. All this was seen. I mean, the opposition, civil society, media call these disturbing trends even as early as last year and said, look, we need to take measures to mitigate some of these disasters. We need to reach out to the IMF and to other international donors. In another mismanagement, the government refused to go to the international community, instead looked to China for international assistance. And so international assistance that's critical to address some of these dire needs were not provided for, and only in April did the government start talks with the IMF, and an IMF deal is going to take several months. So now we have a government, and I'll speak to some of the political issues, which is now looking to India and others to look for bridge financing. But no one is keen to give too much money because our political situation, there is instability. And many have said we need debt restructuring, we need macroeconomic stability, all of those things need to be addressed. But that's in a nutshell, very quickly bringing you up to speed of what's happening and the present situation of governance. We also have a fragmented opposition, so very limited things that can be done by the political opposition. But the positive is we have increasing space for social media criticism, opposition, citizen movement that has been a very effective opposition. So I'll speak to those in a bit. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so one of the things, I mean, this is a survey my institution did in April, and I brought up some slides for you to just understand. 90% of those who were surveyed said that their income has been affected, which has affected people being able to buy food and essential items. And now we have a situation, and that's why I want to bring this up, where people are some people are resorting to only one meal a day. That is the crisis we are at, because the economy and people's livelihoods have been affected. Next slide, please. So I want to kind of spend a bit of time here, because what I mentioned with this moment in Sri Lanka at this present juncture is we have had over 2 months of citizens peacefully protesting because of the crisis, because of the long power cuts, because of essential items not being available. People started protesting outside the suburbs. Colombo is the capital, outside of Colombo and some areas in Colombo from March. So more than 2 months, citizens, regular citizens, I was one of them, we started protesting from early March, basically calling the government to account. We said we cannot have a government that is unable to address basic needs of the people. And taglines like, so the president's name is Gotabaya, The family that I mentioned is the Rajapaksas. So taglines like "Go Home Gota," "Go Home Rajapaksas" came about and started being shared in social media, in different protests. And this is quite remarkable in a country where there was this Rajapaksa family. It's a brand and very popular. I mean, we've seen that in other countries. Very popular, very powerful family. It was now being ridiculed and critiqued. And many people, including their own base, was getting angry because they were being hit by this economic crisis. And so these taglines expanded to other areas, to other taglines. There was debate. And it was quite amazing after so many years of authoritarian governance. I mean, we still have authoritarian governance, but there's now open criticism. And in a way, you can then say, look, democracy has that space for people to also be speaking and critiquing like this. So I mentioned largely peaceful protests up to now, but there were several incidents, the 31st March violence, then we also saw the 9th of May violence. So there were a few instances of violence, which brought about a state of emergency. The president has the power to declare emergency. He has a power to impose curfew. Now, so a state of emergency is very important in this context of democracy because an emergency provides broad powers to the president. Broad powers basically do anything, to arrest, detain, to stop people from moving about, to restricting media. So extremely worrying that we've now had in the last 2 months, 2 states of emergency, one on the 1st of April declared and the other one in May. These have been challenged in court, and we as lawyers continuously challenge, monitor these kind of, we say, extra legal measures and potential abuse. So state of emergency was declared, but despite, and this is quite remarkable too, despite the emergency, despite curfew, thousands have come to the streets. So we've also seen civil disobedience at a large level, unprecedented number in Sri Lanka. So people have had enough, and they are now challenging in every way possible, but very peacefully, pushing back on authoritarian tendencies, pushing back on a president and a government that they say is really impacting democracy in Sri Lanka. So the protests are quite special. I mean, very special in that now they have gone on for so long. We have an epicenter called in Galle, which is called Gota Gama. Again, in Sinhala, it's basically saying for the president to leave. That's the protest site. And for over 50 days, people have been occupying that site. There's been other places in terms of in Sri Lanka where the protests are happening. So across Sri Lanka, different age groups. And this resulted in mass resignations in April, but also the resignation of the Prime Minister on the 9th of May. That's the resignation of the Prime Minister, who's the president's brother. So huge impact in terms of really chipping at the powerful government, but also powerful family. These are very important. And now from the 12th of May, we've had a new Prime Minister who's formed a government, who's trying to now bring in stability, economic and political stability. Next slide, please. So many have, I'll take maybe 4 or 5 minutes. Many have now joined these protests, and this is something we have, so over 50% of those who surveyed said in April they participated. Since then, I think the numbers have increased. Thousands are just coming to the streets peacefully, just coming out, holding banners, holding boards, saying we need a system change, we need the president to resign, we need a change in the political culture, we are trying to redefine citizenship. So quite special. Next slide. But also who was surveyed indicated that there needs to be greater accountability and transparency. Now, many said, 87% said the president needs to resign. So President Gotabaya Rajapaksa should resign. 96.2 said all politicians should be audited because corruption, financial misappropriation is a huge issue in Sri Lanka. So these are also important indicators. I mean, my PowerPoint is with the organizers. You can look at these leisurely. I don't have time to go through everything, but this is just indicative of many overwhelming call for change in Sri Lanka. Next slide, please. So these are some images. I thought I want to kind of share some images because it's very, I mean, we've had protests for decades in Sri Lanka. We have not seen this kind of protest. So the one where there's day and night, that slide, that was on the 9th of April when this big protest started in Colombo in the capital. And that's the protest that has now gone for over 50 days. You could see the masses just coming out. And these other two slides are in the same location on different days, that people have just peacefully come out. They've stayed the night. They've protested during heavy rains, during curfew, and they're not going home. They're basically saying, we're not going home till the president goes home. That is also quite something at a time where, in a context where the president is all powerful, still very powerful because we haven't had any changes, and the military, and there's been intimidation, there's been attempts to stop protests, people have come out. Next slide, please. The protests have also expanded to other areas. So one is the Supreme Court, which is the big picture. So lawyers have protested, and lawyers generally in Sri Lanka do not protest. And we saw massive protests by lawyers in front of the Supreme Court. The other one, the one in the nighttime, that's outside Parliament. So people took the streets outside Parliament. And the other one is a main road in Colombo, but that's a auditorium built by the Chinese. So there were huge protests around that time, that area as well, but different sites, massive numbers coming out. Next slide. And we've also had different forms of protest. So we saw people come into the streets, different banners. We saw cartoons. Cartoons have been very powerful at chipping at the strong ruler. And in the local languages, and I thought, I mean, there's a lot of cartoons, but the one with the two individuals, one is depicting the then prime minister, the other one is the present president. These are brothers. And there was a game at one point saying one should resign and not the other. So, you know, people are now ridiculing the brothers, the family, and saying they both need to go home. And the other one is about protesters who were first, like initially over the years, were very much patronage politics, looking to politicians. Now they're like, we're done with this political class. We're done with the elites. We are doing our own protests. Now, so there's also this kind of criticism coming from images, from cartoons, from posters. But the violence also saw tear gas being used against peaceful protesters. And the slipper, the picture I have put, now this is a life-size installation at a protest site. That's a slipper that's that is basically stamping out a tear gas. And it's showing that people's power is so strong that tear gas canisters are not going to stop the people from protesting. So there's been some very powerful images, installations, posters coming out during this time. Next slide. And of course, I wanted to put this, we've seen different age groups, different kids, pets coming out with banners with the call of change, political change needed, president go home. I mean, this was just to kind of show the different ways people are just saying we need change. Next slide. So last point is that we are now, with all the protests that have seen the pressure, the changes, we are now having a moment where, as I said, we have a new prime minister and a new government. There are proposals to bring in constitutional reform and legal reform. One is to strengthen parliament, one is to strengthen independent institutions, have a check on the executive. So it's very good proposals, but it doesn't go far enough to abolish the executive presidency. It gives a lifeline to the president. It gives a lifeline to the Rajapaksas. So the protesters are still pushing back, saying this is not enough. These are political compromises you all are making. So there's increasing opposition, criticism of the new prime minister. So there's some interesting dynamics coming about in that protesters are not leaving. I mean, there are reduced numbers now because of 2.5 months of protesting, but their calls are very clear. Change in the system, abolish the executive, but the political class, especially the president's party, the prime minister, all of them are trying to bring compromises and retain the executive office. So we're going in for interesting weeks now, interesting times ahead, where people will, we're trying to see if the peaceful nature of protests might change, where there's increasing frustration. I mean, and just to also say, the military has a huge role in Sri Lanka in governance, and this is something to factor in terms of democracy, because of the end of the war and this notion that the military is a great savior, they have entrenched themselves in governance, and this is a huge problem. The economic crisis remains. We are yet to get sustainable assistance. IMF, World Bank, all of them are asking for plans, restructuring. So we are at a time of crossroads. There's been some changes in governance, but it's not enough. The economic crisis has not been addressed, but there has been a reawakening of the people. There is now investigations to look at the impunity, the violence, so some interesting things moving in Sri Lanka. So there's, in a way, at one level, energy and hope, but there's also the realization some of the same people remain in office. Some of the same people are protecting them. So there is that tension as well. So I just want to, I'm ending it here to say that it's a very interesting time in terms of democracy, or the state of democracy in Sri Lanka. We've seen some whirlwind developments in the last few days and weeks. I would say there is still optimism for change because the people have really brought this about. But there is a huge pushback in terms of also going the full length of reform. So we'll have to see. And it's made more complicated because it's not just a political and governance challenge, it's also the economic challenge. So I want to just end it there. And just, I think the slides are done. Is there another slide? Yeah, so I want to end it there and open up for questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Fonseca. It's such a wonderful presentation for Ms. Fonseca about the explanation regarding the current political dynamics in Sri Lanka. Okay, I will open about maybe 10 minutes for Q&A. So please, if the audience have any question for Ms. Fonseca, you can raise your hand, or maybe you can write your question in the chat. Not yet. From the audience, maybe any questions for Ms. Fonseca? You can just speak, no need to raise your hand because we have very limited time with Ms. Fonseca here. Not yet. If not yet, maybe I have one question, Ms. Fonseca. As I read the later article around the democratization in Sri Lanka, I found that as a result of the prolonged economic crisis, and as you mentioned about the Sri Lanka government approach the IMF for the rapid finance instrument and to stabilize the economic crisis. But also I read article about how Sri Lanka is also considering asking for help from the Quad Alliance after China rejection of restructuring debt to Sri Lanka. So my question is, how does we understand the position of the Sri Lanka on the Indo-Pacific geopolitical, or from the geopolitical perspective, are there any Indian or American US interests behind the Sri Lanka political turmoil? Yep.
Yeah, I didn't have time to go into this, and this is very important. The international dimension is critical. Okay. And geopolitics has played a huge role in Sri Lanka. China, as I mentioned, I couldn't mention, under the Rajapaksa, Sri Lanka has pivoted towards China. And one of the reasons also for this crisis is the Chinese loans that have come in for infrastructure projects, which are not providing the dividends that was expected. So these are really got us into, I mean, some say debt trap. I wouldn't say debt trap because there are others also that we in Sri Lanka owe debt to, and larger, mostly sovereign bonds. And so China is not the biggest debt we have, but it's a big sufficient component. So, and people are very now weary of looking to China because there is also this notion that Sri Lanka's sovereignty is under threat because of China's role. So there's different reasons for the suspicion towards China. In terms of looking to assistance, the country that has come to our biggest aid is India in the last few weeks and last few months. They have opened up credit lines for humanitarian assistance and given credit lines for fuel, for rice. And so really India has stepped up. And also said they will continue to support Sri Lanka. And India has a huge role, a huge historical role because of the Tamil community in Sri Lanka. So it goes back decades as well. Now, most recently, I think last week, India and Japan agreed to come together to explore looking to give assistance to Sri Lanka. Now, these are all agreements. We haven't seen anything concrete come about. The G7 also issued a statement saying they want to assist Sri Lanka. The Americans are very involved as well in terms of providing assistance, humanitarian assistance at the moment because of the crisis. So there are different actors who've come on board saying they will look to providing assistance, but nothing significant has come about because of the political economic crisis and the need for bigger restructuring and reforms. So IMF, World Bank, all of them have said without restructuring Sri Lanka's debt, they cannot commit right now. And none of these things are going to yield overnight answers. So there's a lot of interest to support, but at the end of the day, it's our Sri Lankans and the government that needs to take forward in terms of the reform process. But the geopolitics dimension is very much critical in terms of the present crisis.
Okay, thank you for the explanation, Ms. Fonseca. Okay, I will invite maybe any other questions from the audience here, please.
I would like to follow up.
Okay. Yep.
Josh. Yeah, it's me, Josh.
Okay.
Hi, Bhavani. It's me, Josh. Yeah, I've been to Sri Lanka back in 2011. It was still under the Mahinda Rajapaksa's presidency, and it was just a couple of months after the end of the civil war in 2010, I think. Yeah, but back then, the issue about the rise of Mahinda Rajapaksa's kind of like attempt to consolidate power among his ring was loud at that time. And I was surprised that he managed to do that within 10 years in Sri Lanka, where in Asia, Sri Lanka is known to be one among few countries that have long uninterrupted tradition of democracy. And when you mention about like structural reform and so on, what kind of new structure that you have in mind? Because yes, well, we do have problem with the structure here, and it won't end only with replacing Mahinda Rajapaksa and his family. But we need to do something with the structure that that has produced them. That's my question. And how it will affect democracy in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
And thank you. That's a very good question. And I'll answer it very brief. Like I'll try to answer it briefly. The call for reforms really stems from the fact that we need a system change, that we cannot continue in the direction we have been at for the last 40 odd years since this constitution was brought in 78. So that really set up the executive presidency. So now one of the big calls is abolish the executive presidency, have a figurehead president, but bring in the Westminster model, strengthen parliament, and ensure there are checks on every arm of government. So there has to be an independent judiciary, to a robust parliament, to also we have this proposal, which was there before, the fourth arm in a way, which is called the Constitutional Council. It's a mix of parliamentarians as well as respected experts who monitor appointments to key institutions, where the appointments don't come from the executive arm alone. Now, that's quite a novel thing that was in place during the previous constitutional amendment, which was scrapped by the 20th Amendment. So under the Rajapaksas, both Mahinda Rajapaksa and Gotabaya Rajapaksas, they have managed to dismantle institutions, checks and balances, structures that were effective in putting some stop to the executive president. So under both their presidencies, that has happened. People are now sick and tired of this. So they're saying no, Rajapaksa should be in politics. That's one demand. The other one is we need to also have the institutional framework in place that doesn't allow for this abuse of both the politics, but also the economy. And what's interesting, I mean, you mentioned you were in Sri Lanka in 2011. The call for the abolishment wasn't so strong then and hasn't been that strong over the years. But the call for the abolishing of the executive and structural reforms has now really picked up because everyone's feeling the brunt of it. Everyone's feeling the economic crisis. So now it's not an academic exercise anymore, hypothetical thing saying if we have this powerful executive, this could happen. We are now saying we're living the dire consequences of one individual holding so much power. So we need to have structures in place to prevent it from happening. So it's a whole range of reforms that are being discussed. It's also checking the executive, strengthening institutions, strengthening parliament, but also trying to have oversight over institutions like the military and the security sector. So that is also being discussed. And this is in a country where after the defeat of the LTT, the terrorism in 2009, the military was made out to be the saviors. You know, so many of us who've pretty challenged this have also been called traitors because the military, and you all know this, I mean, this whole notion of the military kind of being the answer for all the governance issues, all of that. So it's interesting, it's going to other areas as well, not just executive presidency, but oversight, checks on other key institutions that have played a key role in Sri Lanka. So a whole gamut of reforms. I don't know how much it's going to go, but it's interesting that we are having these debates, a space for this debate, and hopefully we can push these things through very quickly without dragging for too long.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Fonseca. Yeah. Thank you for your presentation, your overview regarding the state of democracy in Sri Lanka, Ms. Fonseca. And now we will jump to the next session. We have Mas Gafar to present, to give us an overview regarding the democracy in Indonesia. Please, Mas Gafar.
Thank you, Nova. I will need help to present my PowerPoint, but I also can do that from here, but it will be easier. Ellie, can you help me with that?
Sure, Mas Gafar.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So in about 10 to 15 minutes, I guess, Nova, won't be too long. I will have a look at some issues in Indonesia and the problem of natural resources and democracy in this country. I must admit that this is a very, very wide issue, and we can talk about a lot of things, but I will have a look at how these issues affect electoral democracy. This is one of core issues in Indonesian democracy. Next slide, please, Shelly. So I will start with the general debates on the natural resource abundance. And literature of social sciences, particularly political studies, believe that there are evidence of resource curses. Countries with lots of natural resources tends to be more authoritarian, and the growth is not the growth in these countries are not so great. So in this point of view, many political and social scientists believe that natural resources is a problematic issue. It's a problematic thing. If you have a lot of natural resources, you may face the problem of authoritarianism. And there are evidence to suggest that countries with natural resources, countries that are rich with natural resources, are not necessarily growing significantly as compared to other countries without natural resource. And evidence in Singapore, for example, or Japan shows that these countries has very limited natural resources, but they can achieve significant growth. While other countries have lots of problems, particularly authoritarianism, rent-seeking activities, actors at state level prefers to seek for their own benefit other than the growth of the country. And the other side of the debate, many scholars believe that resource curse is not true. They believe that natural resource, in most cases, will lead to the wealth of the people and lead to the growing quality of democracy, particularly if this happens in more in industrialized society. These scholars believe that when a country have rich of natural resource and they are ready for industrialization, then in one side they can promote wealth of the people, and on the other side they can also ensure that democratic institutions work properly. So these are two sides of the debate. But then, as always, in the middle of this continuum, there are some scholars who believes that resource curse is not entirely true, but claiming that natural resource will always nurture the wealth of the people and enhance democracy are not the case either. They believe that there are some conditional curses from the natural resource. And they believe that depending on some factors, particularly geography, history, and institutional factors, the natural resource can be problematic for some countries, but can be beneficial for other countries. So that really depends on what kind of geographical condition you have. For example, if you are in an archipelago like Indonesia, that sure is a challenge for the natural resource exploration and the natural resource distribution across the country. If, for example, you have unhealthy institutional setup, then that can also be a problem. So this is the middle of the continuum. And I believe if we look at the next slide, please, Kelly. In Indonesia, what we are seeing is the conditional curse of natural resource. Evidence in Indonesia are not necessarily the proof of resource curse, although at some cases it might be true, but it's not the proof of democracy either. I mean, it's not the proof that natural resource promote democracy in Indonesia. I believe that what happened in Indonesia is more like conditional curse. The problems of geography, history, and institutions have created some problems in Indonesia with regard to the natural resources. First, in Indonesia, the natural resource has encouraged industrializations to some point. Regions with rich natural resource are also inclined towards democratization. For example, in let's say Samarinda. Samarinda is a city in East Kalimantan. There is well developed. I'm sorry, Balikpapan, Samarinda. There is well developed, clean. They are one of the cleanest cities in Indonesia, with modern facilities that are not available in other areas. One of the factors has been the natural resource in Kalimantan. But on the other side, the natural resource have also caused inequality, because there are people who work in this field and gain more wealth than other average people in Indonesia. There are clear signs of inequality between those who work in natural resource industry and those who work in other field. For example, those who are lecturers at universities, like myself and Nova and other lecturers here. We are not as rich as those who are working at the what is it called? Mining company. The other sign of the conditional curse is the endangerment of the environment. Many cases indicate that the mining company, for example, do not always pay attention to the problem they cause to the environment. They have the CSR program that mostly are used to mute the civil society criticism towards the problem of environmental damage. But on the other side, the natural resource also enable the robust electoral politics in many regions. Elections in the regions with rich natural resource are more dynamics and alive compared to other regions in Indonesia. But then it also limits popular control, because I will show you some data from across Indonesia. There are problems of the people to develop the ability to control the elected government, the elected officials in the government, because of many factors that I'm going to talk about in a moment. And last but not least, the problem of the natural resources in Indonesia is also prone to corruption because it is where the big money is, and it is where the huge spending and procurement and other things take place. And we know that 30 to 40% of corruption in Indonesia relates to the procurement activities. And this is evident in many other fields as well. So this is the general picture of Indonesia. Now I'm going to present the first illustrations. This is from the 2019 presidential elections. These figures are from the KPU, and it indicates the official number. We don't know how big is the unofficial number of the fund. There were two pair of candidates in 2019, Jokowi Ma'ruf and Prabowo Sandi. This is the data of the money allocated for the campaign activities. We can see that Prabowo Subianto and Sandiaga Uno provided 192 billion rupiah for their campaign, while Jokowi Ma'ruf reported nothing from their own. So there is no money from themselves, but Prabowo Sandi get 192 billion. But in total, we can see that Jokowi Ma'ruf has a much larger campaigning fund as compared to Prabowo Sandi, because they have support from political parties. They reported almost 80 billion rupiah, while Prabowo Sandi reported less than 5 billion rupiah. From individuals, Jokowi Ma'ruf reported almost 22 billion rupiah, and Prabowo Sandi less than 10 billion rupiah. From groups, 251 billion in Jokowi Ma'ruf, and how much is this? 1.1 billion. It's a very small amount of money. From companies, this is interesting. Jokowi Ma'ruf reported 253, almost 254 billion rupiah. In total, Jokowi Ma'ruf had more than 600 billion, and Prabowo Sandi more than 200 billion rupiah. But where was the money from? Let us have a look at the next slide. We can see that who were the contributors? These are the map that are very familiar among Indonesian people in 2019. That these are the people who contributed to both pair of candidates. We have, for example, Osman Sabta in Jokowi Ma'ruf team, and Luhut Bin Sarpanjaitan, the most famous politician these days. And we have other people, including Surya Paloh, for example, Yusuf Kalla, Abu Rizal Bakri, Wahyu Sakti Trenggono, Andi Syamsuddin Arsyad, etc. While at the side of Prabowo and Sandi, we have actually Prabowo and Sandi themselves, because they are entrepreneurs. They control companies. They contributed to their own campaign. But we also have Hutomo Mandala Putra, we have Sudirman Said, we have Zulkifli Hasan, we have Ferry Mursidan Baldan, and Hasim Joyokusumo. All of them are people with that controls extractive industries in Indonesia, and that was where the big money come from to the campaign team. This indicates that when you control the extractive industry, you control the political funding. And this is evident in Indonesia for almost all direct elections of the president since 2004. Now let's have a look at the next slide. We can see the second illustrations that I'm going to show. It's from local elections. There are many cases, and these are the areas with natural resources. We have South Kalimantan. In Kalimantan, they have coal, oil. Yeah, we also have the district of Kutai Kartanegara, who claim to have the well, they have oil there. They're similar to what Brunei Darussalam have, or even larger. And we have the city of Samarinda with the coal industries. We have the Central Sulawesi and North Sulawesi province, and we also have the city of Makassar. These are the both province and city or municipal that show the strong evidence of linkages between the extractive industry company with the local elections. Let me give you, or let me highlight just one example. One of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. One of 6 cities. One of the 6 regions. Let's have a look at the case of, well, for example, South Kalimantan. In this province, one of the richest province in Indonesia, but when I say one of the richest province in Indonesia, it doesn't mean one of the wealthiest people in Indonesia. In this province, the extractive industry controls no less than 70% of the total area of South Kalimantan. The province itself is about 3,000, almost 4,000 hectares, the area. And in this area, the mining license controls, I believe, more than 1,000, about 1,200 something hectares. And the other is controlled by it's almost 700,000 HGU. HGU itu apa ya bahasa Inggrisnya, no? HGU. Hak guna usaha.
Hak guna usaha.
Hak guna usaha. The right to
use, utilize
the forest.
Yeah.
The permit to use the forest.
Concession to exploit.
Yeah, concession.
Concession to exploit the forest. So the point is, they control over 70%, and it's only controlled by a small number of people. For example, the governor, Sabirin Nur, is the uncle of the very famous actor in mining industry called Haji Isam. Everybody knows him. He can easily control the government through his uncle, who many people believe is just a puppet governor of the South Kalimantan. And Haji Isam does that by funding the campaign. Funding the campaign of Sabirin Nur. Sabirin Nur was a bureaucrat from a humble beginning. He was just a sekcam, if I'm not mistaken, just second person in the kecamatan government. But then he was promoted by Haji Isam to become later to become the governor of South Kalimantan, and he has strong connection with, for example, Airlangga Hartarto, the leader of Golkar, Zulkifli Hasan, Surya Paloh, even Megawati Soekarno Putri. So his strong connection with the political parties was made based on the financial transaction. He supported the political parties, and with that, he gained a very close relationship with those party leaders. And it's easy for him to promote his uncle to become the governor of South Kalimantan. And then, as a result, he could control the province according to his interest. in the last elections, Haji Sahbirin Nur, the incumbent, was challenged by the former deputy minister of law, which is a professor at Gadjah Mada University, called Denny Indrayana. But as predicted, he could not challenge the incumbent. So this is just one example of other regions that I highlighted in these illustrations. I have the data that can be shared directly to the audience here, but regarding the issues in other regions. But the point is, we see some patterns that extractive industry actors make use of elections to gain control over the government. They do that either directly by participating in the elections. For example, Prabowo Subianto and Sandiaga Uno extractive industry actors that make their way to the directly to the politics, or indirectly by supporting the potential candidates to win the elections. And then the electoral actors use the financial resources to buy votes. And that's the problem. That's the problem they cause to the quality of the elections. They do that both by doing the vote buying, so buying the vote directly from the voters, or indirectly by doing the so-called vote trading, buying the vote from the electoral management bodies or from other brokers. As a result, the governments tend to be independent from popular control because the elected government never really needed the support from the people. They bought the vote. They did not gain the vote from the people. They bought the vote. And societies have very limited or even no control over the elected officials. Again, because the elected officials are so independent from the people. And the result of this patterns is that democracy in Indonesia is the one with the absence of popular control. We have free and fair elections, we have regular elections, but we have less control from the people. The electoral actors tend to be disconnected from the societal interest. They are connected to the interest of those companies, of those who controls the extractive industries, but not from the people. So that's it, my presentation, Nova. So thank you for your attention. Terima kasih banyak. We can continue with the question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Mas Gafar, for the excellent presentation regarding the natural resources and electoral politics or electoral democracy. We still have around 50 minutes because Mas Gafar have to leave the forum around 2:30.
2:30, yes.
Yep. So please welcome if you have any question to Mas Gafar.
If you have questions to me, then Yowas will be more than happy to answer.
Come on. Here, okay. So Yan, yeah.
Hello.
Please, yeah.
My name is Soyanai. I just have a question. I'm really interested in natural resource management democracy. The topic is really interesting. And my question is the international actor, their position in the natural resource management and democracy of Indonesia, the case study of Indonesia. Also, I'm from Myanmar, so that I also see the same problem is happening. The same issue that you presented also exists in Myanmar. So that how is the position of the powerful countries in the region and the neighbor countries' influence in that issue? Yeah, how are their position? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So Yan, maybe I will invite two questions again before I give Mas Gafar to answer.
I'm
Sorry,
not too sure that I really catch. It was very noisy here.
Okay, yeah.
Can you summarize the question?
Yeah. So like Sayan Niang asking about the international. Yeah, sorry. About the international actor and their position regarding the natural resources monopoly in the country, in the Indonesian, how the powerful country in the region or neighbor country position regarding this natural resource monopoly, I think. Yeah. Please, Mas Gafar, maybe you will answer the question before I give the other. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yan Naing, yes, a very good question. And in many cases in Indonesia, the local extractive industry actors are mostly in cooperation with the global actors. For example, in North Sulawesi, I did research with NOPA. There was this Newmont, Newmont Minasaraya. Newmont is a multinational corporation. And one of the conflict that occurred in this area was between the local miner and the Newmont people, and the Newmont is in the industry. And the problem was that this global company, can buy the support from the local government, if you like, by funding their political campaign. The other example is in South Kalimantan with the Kideco. Kideco is a company that controls the coal mining, and it's also in a close cooperation with a company from Korea, if I'm not mistaken, Novaya. It's from Korea, and in other regions, it's almost that way, because you could not operate a huge company in Indonesia unless you have a support from a global company. Why? It's not only about the money, but also about how you connect your raw ingredients to the global market. Because, for example, the refinement of the coal could not be done in Indonesia, so they need to bring the raw materials to Korea, for example. They use a very huge ferry that when you go to Kalimantan and the river of Mahakam, you could see like small mountains of coal moving around. It's very interesting. So yes, I agree with that. The problem is also with the connection of the global interest. And the problem is the global interest, the global actors have no interest on the local democracy. So they would not support the local democracy unless it is needed for their benefit. I guess that's my comment, Nova.
Okay, thank you, Mas Gafar. Any other questions from the audience to Mas Gafar? Please welcome. Not yet.
It's not yet. It's none.
Maybe from me, one question, Mas Gafar. Okay.
No. You can ask Joas, not me. Yes, please. I hope it's a comment, more like a comment than
yeah, Mas Gafar.
Mas Gafar is talking about I think the fossil natural resources, right? And the analysis is focused on the democratic aspect of the natural resources management. My question is, now local is also connected with the global discourse about the climate change, and there was a policy to support the climate change mitigation. So many studies then began to asking to analyze about the democratic aspect of the low carbon development, for instance. My question is there a similar pattern of democratization in in the country. Same with the phenomenon of authoritarianism, for example, or the absence of popular control in the country, which have resource have rich renewable energy potential. So is there some similar pattern of authoritarianism in the country with the rich renewable energy? Mas Gafar, I just need your opinion regarding this issue.
Example that are similar to Indonesia or that are different from Indonesian experience?
Maybe can be similar with the Indonesian, the situation.
Well, hang on. Well, I was thinking actually something that is quite the opposite of Indonesian experience.
Okay.
Because at the moment I couldn't think of the country with really similar. Probably Malaysia to some extent, and some countries in Latin America. But I think it will be more interesting for us to look at the country with rich natural resources, non-renewable resources, that prove to be beneficial for democracy and the welfare of the people. Australia can be a good example. For example, Western Australia, and not all part of Australia are resource rich, but Western Australia in the last 2 decades have seriously expanded their explorations of the oil in the region, because it's really rich with oil. And then it caused some problem to students like myself back then, because when Australia finally explored their oil, they just realized, quote unquote, they did not have too many engineers. They need to invite engineers from Indonesia, from India, to stay in Western Australia, and the demand for rent accommodation raised up, and that makes the cost of accommodation in Western Australia very expensive when I was there. It's too expensive for me as a student, but not that expensive for the engineers. But then my point was that they managed to explore the natural resources, and then the democracy remains stable. It is the proof of the theory that if you have strong institutions, then the natural resource abundance would not affect the country's ability to promote the wealth and to maintain democracy. I think that is a good example of resource-rich country that maintains the democracy and the wealth of the people. Thank you.
Okay.
Anyway, it's 14:25. If I may, I will need to get another online meeting in 14:30, and I will have an offline meeting with Vika actually in 15:30. So it's really
Vika is here also, I think.
Okay.
Vika is here. Okay, Mas Gafar, thank you very much, Mas Gafar, for your explanation about the natural resources and democracy in Indonesia. Thank you also for our wonderful discussion today. Thanks to the speaker, thanks to the audience. I believe that we learned a lot from the experience of democracy development, both in Sri Lanka and in Indonesia. So from Sri Lanka, we learned that democracy is currently under the threat from the multiple crises, which is does not bring the prosperity both in economic and cultural sense to the people, but instead creates a lot of violence in the name of maintaining power. Okay, in Indonesia, we also see that if we control the resources, it means that we control the politics also as well. Okay, thank you very much for all here, the audience, and see you next time. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Joas.